Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. It's a little deeper into October than I normally would like doing this, but we're going to be doing the September monthly wrap up. I did want to make sure that I had all of my reviews up, and I did want to get up my spooky season suggested list before I dived into filming the wrap up. So that is why this is going up a little bit late. But my wrap up isn't that exciting because it's only 3 books long, and one of those is a novella, so that's not great. I was traveling for the vast majority of September. I think I was gone for 20 days out of the month, which is a lot. And I had a really hard time finding time to read when I was traveling. I was in Paris, I was in Spain, I went to a wedding in Switzerland. Then I had to fly to Texas. I was in a cocktail competition in Texas. That was really, really fun and amazing. And then I had a wedding in upstate New York. So I've been all over the place, and I tried to get a lot of reading done, and I have 2 books or 2 novels and 1 novella, but for the most part, they were all decently rated. So we're gonna go through and talk about those right now. Actually, I just checked. Every single book this month is a 4-star read, so that's pretty solid. I have my grievances with nitpicky things in all of them, but they were all enjoyable reads, so that's fantastic. And speaking of fantastic, we're going to talk about my first book of the month, and that is Fantastic Land by Mike Bakoven. I have heard so much about this novel for so many years, so I finally picked it up. And I get the hype. I absolutely get the hype. Now, I have in-depth reviews on all 3 of the books I'm going to be talking about today, so I'm not going to talk too in-depth on them. If you want my in-depth thoughts, check out those videos, but let's read the back of this book. Since the 1970s, Fantastic Land has been the theme park where fun is guaranteed. But when a hurricane ravages the Florida coast and isolates the park, the employees find it anything but fun. 5 weeks later, the authorities who rescue the survivors encounter a scene of horror. Photos soon emerge online of heads on spikes, outside of rides, and viscera and human bones littering the gift shops, breaking records for hits, views, likes, clicks, and shares. How could a group of survivors, mostly teenagers, commit such terrible acts? Presented as a fact-finding investigation and a series of first-person interviews, Fantastic Land pieces together the grisly series of events. Cut off from the world and left on their own, the teenagers soon form rival tribes who viciously compete for food, medicine, social dominance, and even human flesh. This new social network divides the ravaged dreamland into territories ruled by the pirates, the shopgirls, the freaks, and the mole people. If meticulously curated online personas can replace private identities, what takes over when those constructs are lost? Fantastic Land is a modern take on Lord of the Flies meets Battle Royale that probes the consequences of a social civilization built online. So I think the back of the book does this book is disservice. It talks very much about how a lot of the motivating factors in this kind of Lord of the Flies situation is dependent on online personas and being connected to the internet. Mike Bakoven tries really, really, really hard to like make that a thing, but as Regina George says, it's never going to be a thing because it's really not what pushes this story forward. What pushes this story forward is a set of interviews from unreliable narrators explaining their perspective on an extremely tragic event where almost everybody being interviewed is in some way, shape, or form a guilty party or some sort of absolutely horrifically tragic victim. Now, there are very few characters that I would paint here as a victim, and a few are definitely like just witnesses as a whole. And I think the only person really that I believe is a victim is the one character who hides out in a hotel for the entirety of this experience. And the reason I bring that character up is because that character is, without a doubt, my favorite part of this entire story. It's the scariest part. It's the most absurdist part. And it's this nice little break from all of the crazy chaos that is going on in the rest of the story, and this nice little microcosm of just how this situation bleeds over to everybody involved in different ways. So I really, really appreciated that. Another thing that I loved about this novel is, again, we have this whole series of unreliable narrators, and as you get further and further into the book and you start to see kind of the other accounts backtracking into the story to bring up previous events, it's really interesting to see how this book, the fictional author writing and conducting these interviews, how there is an agenda of how to paint certain characters. And I really loved the read between the lines that this book has of being like, is the leader of the pirates as bad as everybody says he is? Which, yeah, absolutely. Or are there other people who might be worse? And I think it's a really interesting way to go through this book, of just knowing, like, don't believe everything that you see in this story. And I think you get so much more out of it. One of my big criticisms with this novel, though, is all of these characters are only interviewed, apart from one time. We get one person who gets like a follow-up interview, and I feel like in real life that wouldn't happen. And I would have loved to see more interviews later down, like follow-up interviews with some of the characters from the beginning of the book popping up towards the end, because I think it became very difficult to figure out who was who when you only ever see their name at the top of the chapter, and then kind of have to be like, oh wait, who was that? Who did that mention? Like, I would love if they had more of a narrative voice throughout the story instead of just these larger chunks to get it through. But I found this book very scary. I found it very well done. I found it really, really unsettling towards the end. And I did love the Lord of the Flies nature of it all. And I know I said this in my in-depth review, but I really liked the concept of, in Lord of the Flies, you have, like, I believe they're all 12, and raising the age in this story to about, like, 22. I think that really helped kind of push how far these characters were going forward. And this kind of idea of, like, peer pressure and, like, mob mentality. I thought it was really, really interesting to see that kind of devolution into absolute chaos and horror. I thought that was really, really well done. I do wish a little bit more time had been spent building up to how this kind of collapse of society happens within the amusement park. I think that was a little bit rushed. But I do think for what it is, this is a really unique, interesting, and scary novel. So this was a 4-star read for me. Okay, next up we have Crypt of the Moon Spider by Nathan Ballingrud. I did get this in my most recent Nightworms package. I have never heard of this author before. Spiders scare the crap out of me. And this was a weird one. This was a weird one. Let's read the back. In a cave beneath the dense forests and streams on the surface of the moon, a gargantuan spider once lived. Its silk granted its first worshippers immense faculties of power and awe. It's now 1923, and Veronica Brinkley is touching down on the moon for her intake at the Barrowfield Home for Treatment of the Melancholy. A renowned facility, its treatments have been lauded by many. All it takes is a little spider silk in the amygdala, maybe a strand or two in the prefrontal cortex, and perhaps an inch in the hippocampus to expunge all those troublesome thoughts and ideas. But patients aren't the only ones with trouble on their minds, and although the spider's been dead for years, its denizens are not. Someone or something is up to no good, and Veronica just might be the cause. Looking back, this novella really reminds me of Shutter Island meets like an episode of The Twilight Zone. I know this is the beginning of a series, but I really did feel like this was just a standalone great episode of like episodic horror TV. Like, I said this in my original review, but like if this was a story in Guillermo del Toro's series Cabinet of Curiosities, I'd be like so on board with this. It definitely landed more in like the fantastical sci-fi genre for me than it did horror. There is a lot of like dread and really grotesque body horror in this book, and they're giant spiders, so like, okay, yeah, it's horror. But there was a lot of like world building, a lot of science fiction and fantasy. And one of the things that really irked me with this novel is it was set in 1923, but it is clearly set in this kind of futuristic style of 1923 where we have the technology to go and inhabit the moon in the 1920s. And yet the rest of the mentality of people is still social norms of the 1920s. So that was a little jarring for me. I just wish that it had not been set in any time period at all, or at least not something that the reader would be familiar with historically. I think it did a disservice for that. I think if we had just made it like, yes, they kind of have this 1920s like social mentality and they have the technology to inhabit the moon, and yet they're still kind of way back in the day with like women's rights and the fact that like women are like property to their husbands. Like, I really wish that like it had just been set in like a world where that happens, and not trying to remind us that like 1920s New York and like the gangster scene there was there, and like Nebraska is a thing. Like, I feel like every time I'm reading something like fantastical or science fiction-y and like I hear like Nebraska, it takes me out of it so fast. So that, it definitely suffered from that. But I did like our main character. I thought she was a very cool and tragic character, and I enjoyed the world building that was here. But it's one of these stories where, like, while I did really enjoy it, again, it was a 4-star read for me, I don't feel the need to pick up another book in this series. I think I got what I needed out of this. It was interesting, it was weird, it was whimsical, it was gross, it was well done, but I don't need more. It didn't leave me wanting more afterwards. It was a very, like, open and closed book for me. And I know I've been saying this a ton on my channel because I just made a whole video on it, but I did just make a whole laid out video reasoning out why I don't love series. And this is one of those books that I'm just like, this can just be a standalone, and I think we're good. I think we're good. I don't need to keep continuing on in this world. It didn't grip me enough, but it gripped me enough to be like, that was cool, that was spooky, that was weird. 4 stars. So there we go. Crypt of the Moon Spider. Very interesting. Okay, and last but not least, we have I Was a Teenage Slasher by Stephen Graham Jones. Now, I just uploaded a whole video dissecting my thoughts on this, so please, 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 please check that out. If you were disappointed in the conclusion to the Indian Lake trilogy, I think you'll like this. I'm gonna read the inside plot. La Mesa, Texas, July 1989. It's the summer before senior year for best friends Tolly Driver and Amber Dennison. They're not in the marching band, they're not in the FFA, they don't really count. Amber's the only native student in town, and Tolly's only on the radar due to his father's recent death. This is all about to change. Bodies are going to be dropping fast in this small West Texas town. For a few unbearably hot days that will resonate through the decades and even get made into a TV movie, Tolly and Amber will be famous, notorious even. Finally, everyone will know their names. This is Stephen Graham Jones x-raying the slasher genre, interrogating its motivations over the shoulder and in the voice of the killer itself. From a town he did some growing up in a year he was also 17. The kills will be poignant, the jokes will hurt, and the violence will be endearing. Everything's turned around for Tolly, for Amber, for all of La Mesa, Texas. Be happy you weren't there, be happy you're only reading about it. I find it a little difficult to review this book without doing spoilers. I'm going to do the best that I can. My video is filled with spoilers, just so you know. Towards the end, I mark where spoilers pop up, so it's not all spoilers. But this is the book that Stephen Graham Jones chose to write instead of the conclusion to The Angel of Indian Lake, and I feel like a lot of the really good ideas that I felt were missing in The Angel of Indian Lake made it into I Was a Teenage Slasher. This is sort of, in my opinion, kind of regurgitation from a more tragic angle of My Heart is a Chainsaw, where instead of from the perspective of like the would-be final girl, we are in the perspective of the would-be slasher figure. And it's set in the 80s. It's very, very, very 80s. It's also set in Texas, and there's a lot of things in here that are like very, I think, individual to Texas. And I had to like Google what some of these things were. So that's definitely in there. But I definitely appreciated it far more than The Angel of Indian Lake. It follows the slasher stories. We get like that kind of fun, tongue-in-cheek, like 17-year-old banter that I felt like Indian Lake was missing. Indian Lake felt very, very serious and final. This has a lot of serious moments and a very, very bleak ending, and yet it still felt lighthearted at times. The first third of this book I actually thought was exceptional. I was so on board with it, and then it kind of dragged for a bit and then picked back up and became very, again, bleak and depressing. And I said this in my main review, but there's a lot of like absence of free will that plays a vast role in the story that kind of rubbed me the wrong way. So I wasn't the biggest fan of that. And there are these kind of weird moments of animal cruelty. I guess animal cruelty is the right word. Like, harm comes to animals in a not so pleasant way. And it didn't feel like it needed to be there. It did bother me that it was in there, but it wasn't like I'm not going to pick this novel up because of how those scenes were written. So just know that going in. And I did really enjoy Tolly as a character and Amber as a character. Again, I say this all the time when I'm talking about Stephen Graham Jones. He has a writing style that I don't think is for everybody. And it can be very confusing. It can be very cluttered. It can be very scattered. But I think when he's writing teenage characters, he tones it down a little bit from kind of this like high literary angle and makes it more accessible. And I think he does a really good job with this, because we do have our narrator being our main character, who for the vast majority of the book is a 17-year-old boy. So I did really greatly appreciate the language in this story being a little bit more simplistic, if that's the best way to say it. It's scary, it's gory at times. It's got a lot of heart in this novel, but at the same time too, it has a lot of very bleak and depraved things. And I feel like there's certain things in the story that, like, Stephen Graham Jones thinks happens in a lot of slashers, but, like, doesn't always. Like, he kept saying, like, 9 out of 10 times, like, the final girl has, like, and this is an actual line in the book, 9 out of 10 times the final girl has, like, I think an androgynous name, like a name that can go either as a guy or a girl. And it was kind of like Lori, Nancy, I guess, like, you could argue, like, Ripley, even though that's a last name, and I guess Sydney, technically. But I was like, Sally, right? Sally is Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I think. So I was like, I don't know about that. I don't know. That was a stretch. So, yeah, I don't know. There were definitely some things that I didn't love about this story. I didn't kind of love, like, the magic or the lore, but I thought as a slasher story, it was there. And I felt like this needed to be the third book in the Indian Lake trilogy. And I said this in my big review, but, like, drop the trilogy concept, just make it a series and keep writing your teenage slasher horror stories. Because Stephen Graham Jones does a good job with that. When he tries to elevate them and make them more adult, I feel like is when we start to lose what I love about his love of writing teenage slasher stories. He tries to overcomplicate them, and there's a lot of overcomplicated things in here, and a lot of, like, unreliable narrators, and not really understanding what's real and what's not, or what actually happened, and was it part of the TV movie? Is it, like, a forgotten memory? Is this the truth? Like, there's a lot of that in the story, and a very, 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 very unreliable narrator to tell it to us. So you are kind of scratching your head at certain things. I mean, like, I don't know if that makes sense, but I feel like that was the point with us. So take that as you will. Anyways, 4 stars, enjoyed it. Very, very happy that at least I had that after the travesty that was The Angel of Indian Lake. So thanks, Steven, I guess. Anyways, that is all that I have for you guys today. As always, I try to post every Monday and Thursday, sometimes on Saturdays. If you enjoy these videos, please hit the like and subscribe buttons down below, and I will catch you on the next one. Mwah.